Oh, hello.
Hello, welcome to Portal to Fantasy. Abi is answering her DMs right now, so I'll be hosting the show. Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah,
I'm
don't
just
worry.
a very busy person, so.
Yeah.
But I did decide to turn up.
In our pre-show prep, she was just like, I need to arrange dinner. I need to do this and that and this. So
I'm a woman who juggles many hats.
You're a jet setter.
That's the word I'm going to choose there. Yes, a jet setter. Yeah. I just made myself laugh because I was going to say something funny and I decided not to. Yes.
Don't worry. We know it would have been a great effort for you to have made a joke. Restraining yourself too much.
Yes, do you know what? It could have ended up in one of those YouTube videos that's like women trying to be funny compilation. So
yeah, hosted by Andrew Tate, probably. We talked about.
Yes,
we're not going to talk about Andrew Tate now, but Andrew Tate's fascinating.
We'd probably get a lot more views if we did talk about him.
We titled it like "A Woman Argues About Andrew Tate Online."
Yes, or like Owen Edwards owns stupid bimbo.
Yeah, well, I have retitled all of our episodes to be that. I don't know if that's offensive, but
I feel like whatever gets the views, it's fine. I'm still answering this DM, so I'll let you introduce things.
Yes, yeah. So you're welcome to Portal to Fantasy, where we talk usually about books and sometimes about Andrew Tate. Today, I think what we want to do for this episode is Abi has had a summer of indie reading. She's mostly been trying to read indie and self-pub. We will talk about other reading we've done, and I guess maybe reading plans, because you're obviously about to finish your summer of self-pub. So maybe we can talk about what's next. And we'll see what else comes up. I guess we'll wander amongst the flowers and find out what's going on. So, Abi, just as a literal warm-up question, how have you found the English heatwave of 2022? Have you enjoyed it?
No, not really. It's made me realize that I do not want to live in a hot country, because every winter I say to my husband, can we move somewhere hot, please? Because I really hate the winter, because, I get like very extreme seasonal depression. Turns out the heat is not what I'm missing. That is not what I'm missing. There is a great difference between being on holiday somewhere that's 35 degrees Celsius and having to just go about your normal daily life, just doing things in 35 degrees heat. So it's just, it's been like, I've tolerated it. I think I have a fairly good tolerance for hot weather. It's not like I've been incapable of doing anything, but I enjoy somewhere between like 22 to 25 is, for me, my favorite.
Yeah, you want permanently mild temperatures. You have told me before that you literally avoid the sun, though.
Yeah, I don't go out in the sun, no.
Yeah, you want it outside, hot, relatively warm, and you're inside.
Yes, I will. Even if I'm like walking to the shop in our village, I'll like take an umbrella if it's really sunny.
Well, surely, do you not have your own
parasol? Parasol, or like just I have a huge wide brimmed hat, because I do not want the sun touching me for many reasons, but most of all because I use a retinol cream on my face, which will make me burn like a vampire if I go into the sun. So in that way, it's double anti-aging, because not only is retinol an anti-aging thing, but it also stops me from going out in the sun, which will age me sooner. So there you go.
I guess
I don't work for
you're a vampire would also mean you're burning like a vampire.
Yes, that could also possibly be true. That's one of the rumours going around about me. When we first met, you heard the rumour that I am actually just AI. But no, I could also just be a vampire.
So what have you been reading in your summer of self-pub? I know it's not all been self-pub. You were talking about H.G. Wells as well. What about
I didn't mean to pull such a horrible face then, but I read War of the Worlds and it was like not my fave. I didn't hate it, but also wasn't like doing everything for me. So I'm just...
Because you really liked The Time Machine and The Invisible Man, didn't you?
Yes. I felt like there was a huge void where I was expecting there to be a real like emotional pull to the book and a really well developed protagonist. But instead it's like, I think because the plot, I'm assuming at the time, would have been really revolutionary, a bit like Frankenstein-esque, in the sense that he's coming up with this thing that, okay, maybe people are making up Martian stories. I'm assuming that was a thing that people did talk about, that could, Martians maybe around this time. But he's coming up with this thing that is really, the heat rays and stuff like that. It's all so interesting, I'm assuming, at that time period. But for me, it's like, okay, heat ray, whatever. I can appreciate how incredible that would have been to read at the time, because that would be like a whole new thing, right?
Well, and I guess it's
just not very interesting the way that it's written.
Well, you also have like Britain having to fight them, so I guess it's in familiar places like the Battle of Dorking and stuff.
And I did think the ending was actually really clever, and I think the narrative itself, works really well, and it is an interesting story. I was just like expecting a lot more from Wells in terms of character development, layering in more humor. He seems to be able to layer in a lot more, not necessarily ha-ha funny, but kind of like, oh gosh, that's kind of funny, but it's also really disturbing. He can normally layer in a lot more of that. And there's normally this real emotional pull. Like in The Invisible Man, it's kind of this real tragedy, and it feels like a real tragedy because it's an emotional tragedy.
Yeah.
And it's the same with The Time Machine. It's an emotional tragedy. And then with this one, it's just kind of like, oh, it's like an action film. It's chaotic. And that's kind of what it felt like.
I wonder how much some of that is an issue of time, that things that are affecting, like, you are British in 1900 or whatever it was. Like, I forget exactly which year it was published. And, like, these things land and they just blow everything up. At like the heart of the world, the capital city of the Western world is taken over by things, and then there is, and this is the kind of great dramatic scene in the book. Really, the ultimate dramatic scene in the book is the Thunder Child, isn't it? And so you have this ultra modern ship that that to protect the refugees goes on a suicide mission against these Martians, and I think like does it destroy two possibly? And then is destroyed. Like so there's something quite traumatic about that, I think. And so I wonder whether there's emotion for Wells and for his readers in seeing the familiar and the comfortable and the safe being overturned in a way that for us, we're less like ironclads, that doesn't really affect us in the same way.
Or it almost feels like if you've grown up watching Doctor Who and stuff like that, it's like, oh, okay, London's being bombed again by aliens. Yeah, it's like, it kind of didn't... Right, it kind of lost that emotional impact just based on what's happening, which is the one thing with Frankenstein, is I really feel like even now, I don't think there are that many things that have been done that aren't just adaptations of Frankenstein that really have that really disturbing, I don't know, I guess it kind of feels akin to watching like a really good episode of Black Mirror where you're like, oh, that's really messed up. And that's what I felt like coming away from Frankenstein. And while I have lots and lots of criticism of it as a book in terms of the emotion being like really hammered in at some points that feel a bit unnatural, and then sometimes just completely withdrawn, and it's a bit chaotic in that sense, I feel like the story itself is naturally tragic, and she doesn't even need to really force that. But I felt like in War of the Worlds, it's like maybe just to a modern reader, I could really appreciate what that would have felt like reading it at the time. But as a modern reader, I'm just like, okay, I'm just expecting David Tennant to just like wander in at some point and be like, oh no, London's on fire, and it's like,
no, I think that's a really interesting observation. And I think you could write an essay on like sci-fi and imperial anxiety, and how much kind of a weak defenseless Britain is partly an aftermath of Suez and things like that. But I think that's so. Self-pub, that's the other thing. I know you've read that recently. I know you're reading some other stuff, and we'll talk about future plans toward the end. But Self-pub summer. What have you been reading this summer?
Stuff. So I've read a whole load of stuff. So I think the last thing we talked about was God Emperor of June, which is what I was reading when we last spoke. Yes. Since then, I've read The Diary of a Nobody, which is not self-pub. It's just like, it's like a classic, I guess. So here's all self-pub. I've read a collection of short stories called Watchwords, which is like they're all based on different classic watches that the author owns, and he wrote short stories based on Those, it was really interesting when I first looked at I sometimes, weirdly, I don't look at the synopsis of a book, but I will sometimes look at other reviews before I read it. So I won't like look at what the author says about it, but I'm like, oh, what have other people said about it? And there are quite a lot of people who were like, oh, it's really pretentious and it doesn't make sense and all of that stuff. So I was like, oh, okay. But I went into it and actually I really enjoyed it, and it was quite farcical and a bit irreverent and kind of rude to a point of it being like vulgar at some points. And I think it just hit me with a type of comedy and a type of like tragedy in life and realism in life that I find amusing and also sad. So I enjoyed it. But I can see why people who don't find that style of
comedy and tragedy are like summed up by vulgarity.
I feel like there is like a hand-in-hand crossover between the two. Do you know what I mean? Tragedy can be quite gross at a physical level. And then comedy, you can also find a lot of humor in physically gross things. Like embarrassment, I think embarrassment isn't a tragedy, but there are lots of like physically disgusting or embarrassing things that happen to people that there can be like a lot of humor in it if you have a particular sense of humor. And I feel like I do have that sense of humor. So I did enjoy it for that reason. I also read somebody's memoir of her son dying, which was kind of depressing, but I felt cathartic for her to write about that. And then when I came across it, I felt like kind of if people go out of their way to reach out when they're like suffering with grief, if I feel like I'm in a place where I can receive that message, I feel like just knowing that somebody has listened to you sometimes is enough to make you feel a bit more like grounded in that. So I just really wanted to read it, and I enjoyed it. It was difficult because it's a woman talking about how her son is no longer alive. So it wasn't like an enjoyable read, but yeah. Waiting for Saturday, which was like a kind of light romance, but with kind of like a dark undercurrent because the female like love interest is stuck in like a very abusive relationship. So you've kind of got that. So on the one hand, it's kind of like you've got the light whirlwind romance, and then the other side you've got this kind of tugging force of her feeling very compelled and kind of controlled in another relationship. So that was an interesting one. And then something called Choosing the Dark, which is about like a band in the 1980s crosses over into the AIDS crisis, drugs, rock and roll, punk kind of thing, but mostly it's about people really struggling with their own existence. So it's kind of a bit like philosophical in that sense.
Grim. I think of all the reviews that you did, the one that you sounded most positive about was the one about child loss, in terms of like that was cathartic. The rest they all sound pretty grim.
Yeah, I think though that's my natural inclination, is to read books that I'd like, this about me. I like books that have a really dark undercurrent to them, because I find it a really compelling feature of a book. I often say like, oh, I can't read a book that doesn't really have a romance in it. That's not true. I just like a romance in a book. But if I just read a romance that didn't have anything kind of a little bit gritty in it or grisly, it would be fine, but I would struggle to be like, wow, I really love that.
I see, in some ways, like I think I feel about books very differently. That I think it's a Chesterton quote, but the idea that we people don't need, we write about we write fantasy and write about dragons not because people need to know dragons exist. People already know dragons exist, but they need to know they can be beaten. And so I find like relentlessly dark stuff. I'm like, yeah, I can find that anywhere. I can turn on the news and find out about that. And so in that sense, maybe like
isn't it funny because I don't watch the news?
No. Well, maybe if you don't know what else is happening in the real world, you're like, maybe I need to read this grim thing to find out.
I think I prefer it. It's like I grew up, I was a Jacqueline Wilson girl growing up, and those books are dark.
Yeah, which is a bunch of like neglected and abused children in brightly coloured books.
Right, but then the protagonists always kind of, there's this part of them that they don't seem to realise how objectively miserable their own life is. They'll be like, oh, mum locked us in our flat while she went on holiday with her new boyfriend, and it's up to me to try and look after my 3-year-old brother. And as a child, you read that and you're like, wow, this is really strange but interesting. And as an adult looking back at it, you're like, this is really messed up. But it's like just this way, I guess, to like interact with dark and uncomfortable things that feels slightly lighter because you're being led through it by the good luck.
Good luck with the presentation, Isaiah. And we'll see you on the replay.
Well, I guess we won't, but you'll see us.
Well, no, we'll be watching him.
We'll come back and just wait for you to comment something.
Exactly.
I do like the dark. I do like a bit of. I do like things with a bit of grit.
I have read some darkish books in some ways recently. 2 books I finished recently. So the 3 most recent fiction books I finished in hard copy. I don't have any of them here, but were Canticle for Legal Wits, Broken, which is by Walter M. Miller, Broken Sword by Paul Anderson, and what did I just finish? The Stars My Destination by Alfred Bester. And 2 of them, Stars My Destination and Canticle for Legal Wits, both definitely deal with nuclear war anxiety and about like apocalypse and stuff. And Canticle for Legal Wits is about like everything has been blown up and all that survives of knowledge. There's this kind of monastery where they're gathering remnants and they don't really understand them and stuff. The Stars My Destination is a revenge thriller where a guy is stranded in space and he once he gets back, he goes on like an insane revenge rampage. And this is like 1956. They're both very similar times actually. And Broken Sword, which was again, I think 55 or 56. It was the same year as The Two Towers, by Tolkien. It's a kind of tragic Norse saga where things just get sort of relentlessly darker and worse on the whole. You'd love it. And it was an interesting thing reading them because I'd say there is in Canticle and in Stars My Destination there is something else going on. Broken Sword is pretty just relentless, but it's certainly a thing where like it was on the darker side of my average reading. I think
interesting because I wouldn't read horror. Like I wouldn't read horror genre, or I don't like things that are purposely scary. I wouldn't want to read something that's designed to make you like lose sleep at night. But I like things where I find it really hard to enjoy stuff where everything is just nice.
So these probably are too relentlessly stressful for you. But the LA Quartet, I've read the first by James Elroy. They are like really dark and twisty. If you want messed up romances, which you do like messed up romances,
I do love them the best,
I definitely say there is a degree of like background stress with it. There's not always just because you're like, oh my word, everything is so horrible and just bad things are going to happen. They are 1950s, written in the 80s and 90s, 1950s cop stories. Very, very good film. Actually, this might be the way for you to do it. I think it's on Netflix. LA Confidential adapts the 3rd of these and is in the top 5 or 10 best films I've ever seen. And you should watch it. You could convince your husband to watch it. I think he'd probably enjoy it. And,
he's more of like a TV film person than I am.
You concentrate it into I think it's just over 2 hours. You could concentrate the experience into that. But yes, I do like some, but I'd say Elroy is not hopeless. They're dark, but they're not at all hopeless. I actually think this is a really interesting thing. I've thought about making a video about this to do with morality in A Song of Ice and Fire and other books. In that I think a really interesting misconception of George R.R. Martin's books is they're really amoral, like just everyone's terrible there. And same with Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy. And I'm like, I've read those books and grim stuff happens and bad stuff happens, but they're not at all amoral. They're in fact strongly moral. They have obvious views about what's moral behavior and what's not. And to some degree, they say, look, bad things just happen to good people. But they also have a degree of dramatic logic where those things happen for particular reasons. It's not there's basically not random accidents that kill major characters. That doesn't happen.
I do like a book where bad stuff happens to the good characters. I don't know why. It just is more interesting. It's not like I'm willing those bad things to happen to them, but I find it more interesting.
I'm going to read Robin Hobb's Assassin's Apprentice next month, maybe, and The Realm of the Elderlings, her big series, is widely seen as just a series where she tortures her characters, and like they're not sad stories necessarily, but like they are just like, look at all the horrible, grim stuff that happens to Robin Hobb's characters. And I'm a bit like wary of that, but then I like James Elroy. I can deal with this other stuff. So I don't know. For me, I think I want like I think some sense that there is progress possible. I don't mean political progress in that sense. I mean personal progress chiefly. Yeah, and I think maybe that's kind of very informative about my views, but like the sense that like, yeah, in grim situations, people can still become better people. I think it's why I like one reason I like Book of the New Sun so much, which is a book. Wolfe, when asked whether it's a Severian is Christ or a Christ figure, it's like, no, he's not a Christ figure. He's a small c Christian in the sense that he's on this pilgrim's progress to become better at some level. And I think one reason I like the Book of the New Sun is it's an incredibly screwed up situation, and yet Severian is kind of trying to just find a way through it.
I liked the kind of that kind of like background feeling of like darkness in the book. I think I would have found it really difficult if it was a book that's like, let me describe all of these disgusting things that are happening for you, because for me that would be, I don't want to read that. But it was kind of quite dark, having him being this almost like bouncing narrator going through, being like, hey, this is my life in this kind of guild of torturers, and here's where we kill people because that's our job.
I haven't read very much. It's not my priority read, but I have started Calday of the Long Sun by Wolfe, which is the first half of this. This is like much face value easier reading than Book of the New Sun, the Book of the Long Sun. It's really lovely, and very different. Silk is a really different character to Severian. I massively enjoyed the first two books, but I have started reading that on the note of Gene Wolfe. I've mostly been reading very recently. Oh, I also finished a classic on audio. I didn't actually finish this version of it. Waverley by Walter Scott, which, Abby, you know the feeling of this. It's really good, and then the second volume is just like, here's some random stuff. By the way, we're ending. Is like it feels like
it's like a classic thing, isn't it, that they do?
And it wasn't even that he was writing it in a serial. He didn't write it in a magazine. It's just obviously, and this was the first of his novels. He published it anonymously because he's well known as a poet, but I think it was like he didn't want to be immediately associated with these very different products. So he wrote it anonymously, and he's known as the author of the Waverley novels, which means, well, the author of Waverley, which means the whole series is called the Waverley series. They're not mostly connected. There's a couple of small connections. They're mostly nearly all historical fiction from his point of view. So this is about 1745 and 6, written in about 1812 or something. I don't know. 1814 published. And it's about an English soldier who's caught up somewhat foolishly and romantically in the Jacobite rebellion, and about the two women that he meets, and about his friends, and about battle and disaster and things like that. And it's really fun, and it has a lot of humor and good description and tension, and then a lot of the tension and structure kind of drops out in the second half in volume 2. It's still good, but you're like, it's like half a great novel and half an okay novel.
Yes,
you get that.
There seems to be a running theme for a lot of that time period, don't you find? Like and do you know what I think? It's for a lot of people, they get like this, what I want to call like Jane Austen syndrome, where that's like their first introduction into kind of older classics, right? Or literature of the early 19th century or kind of like later 18th century. That's their first introduction into that sort of literature. And then they try and hit up something else. And it's like, wait, why does the story just die halfway through? And then we just go on the author's long philosophical and moral ramblings, and then the story just ends. And it's like, so.
The problem here is that Austen is like one of the top 10 novelists ever in the English language, I think is the problem. And by that, I don't mean, I mean, objectively, she's so technically good at structuring plots and running character arcs. in like her top 3 novels or something, we're talking about things where there's virtually no flaws structurally, and which is incredible, really. Like, and I think when you compare that and say, oh, I'll go and read Scott, who's contemporary with her, obviously, very slightly later than her first publications. You go to Maria Edgeworth, who Walter Scott liked. You go to, I'm trying to think of other close contemporary novelists to them. But yeah, you go slightly earlier, you go to Stern or Fielding or Richardson, obviously 2 of your favourites.
Right. Even Fielding, his structure is much better than Richardson's, but still he'll just go off for like 7 chapters on a random tangent that has nothing to do with the story. Literally nothing.
Yeah, and I don't think that's, as you say, it's not uncommon. And it continues later, though, for slightly different reasons. Like you see that with Dickens, the great novelist of the rest of the 19th century, who just...
Thackeray does it in Vanity Fair as well.
Yeah, Thackeray too. Because they're both writing serially, I think you just find, like, they just go all over the place. There's loads of random stuff, and Dickens evidently had no real idea of a lot of how his novels were going to work. He was just like, here's my general idea.
Yeah.
I'll write some of this.
Has like a concept, and then he's like, now I'm going to do 900 pages of this.
Well, it's almost like discovery writing to the extreme, because he's literally publishing it. Whereas
pretty incredible then when you think how good it is, considering that's how they worked.
Yeah, it was basically, and there are lots of things like I have. Oh, do you know what? I'll go and get them. Give me a moment. You can talk to the audience out.
Hi, Owen. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to sit here while Owen goes off to get his books, which I think are Charles Dickens books. So there you go.
No, not Charles Dickens books. Strand magazine bind-ups. So this is the volume that, well, one, this has the first Sherlock Holmes short story in it. It wasn't the first Sherlock Holmes story, because I think there was a novel in the 1880s, and then Conan Doyle wrote short stories in the 90s. And yeah, pretty much that's Adventure 2, the Red-Headed League. That's, wow. We've got to stop the Red-Headed League. But there's so many. There's an article here called Cats. It is double column. It is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 18 columns of small text discussion about cats. And then there's like stories. Have you ever heard of the wonderful short story Quarantine Island by Walter Bezant? There's so much copy written for these things that now goes on TV. Basically, the Strand magazine, it was a weapon for an older, more civilized time. But it's very much like none of that exists now because you just watch it on TV. All the pulp stuff goes on TV. The same with pulp sci-fi fantasy from the 20s to the 50s, say, is there's so much of it. And we don't know, you and I have never read any of it functionally. I've read more of it than you have, but like functionally, none of it. Because there's just so many chapbooks and magazines that have disappeared. Lovecraft was mostly published in like very small independent print. He didn't even get paid for it, and most of those things obviously don't exist now. Like all the copies have gone missing or destroyed. And I think that's the thing with the 19th century, like the fact that Dickens wrote so much, was so prolific, but it's good is a mark of quality, because virtually all the people from that era who wrote in the Strand is later than the Rambler, but the same principle, just it's all disappeared and we don't know any of it. But yeah, no, so I enjoyed Waverley. I've started listening to David Copperfield on the note of Dickens.
That's on my list of audio. Well, I've got the audiobook loaded, but then part of me's like, oh, should I just read the regular book? You know, I don't know. I could do both. I could switch it up, couldn't I?
So I just always have a classic audiobook on the go, because it is a way for doing chores with and stuff like that. Audiobook. Yeah, because
mine is the Samuel Johnson biography at the moment, and sometimes I'm there like loading the dishwasher and I'm just like, I do not need to know this much about Latin grammar, but thank you.
Yeah, yes you do. Yeah.
Now I know.
Yeah. The other book I'm reading, like that, in terms of novels that I'm well into, is this is called Saldren's Garden by Jack Vance. Look at how bad this cover is. Can you see their faces? Like they're like dogs.
Is that like a very? Is that What edition is that? Has that been published by a real
That is,
publishing
so no, this
house?
is a modern print-on-demand reprint, possibly. 2002, Spatlight Press Signature Series, Volume 52. I think partly put back into print by his family foundation. So it is a modern one, and it's small press modern. So I think that's why. And it was printed by Amazon. So it's, yeah, pod. And I'm glad I could get it, but I think, yeah, they've just paid someone like 60 quid to draw two really, really bad faces, haven't they? Yeah, it's kind of like a proto Game of Thronesy political thing, but with a romance in it and adventure and like fairy story, like fairy myth and pagan myth and Arthurian influences. And yeah, it's like I've enjoyed it. There have been a couple of odd moments. Vance's relationship, and I'll do a review of this properly at the time, but like a thing that came to my mind is that both the way he talks about women, including children, female children, is weird, but actual social attitudes are very middle of the road, 20th century liberal progressive, like as in they are very modern attitudes. With children, we're meant to sympathize with that she doesn't want a forced arranged marriage for political reasons. We're meant to really be, and there's kind of half an argument given for the other side, but like, you know, the point is made that she's incredibly privileged and this is just the cost of that. But it's something where George R.R. Martin would be a lot more ruthless about that and be like, no, this really is like, there's a strong argument for my medieval family, royal family, political arranged marriage makes sense. Here, you're meant to really sympathize with children. But then you're also like, I don't know why people find her attractive when she's 9.
Little bit creepy.
It's weird, but Vance is always like that. Vance is like, writes beautiful stuff and then really weird. I found this with The Dying Earth. Liam, our friend, would agree that like it's the first book is amazing, and then you keep reading, you're like, man, this guy Kugel. Some people really like Kugel, but there's 2 novels about him, and he's not just a dreadful person and an anti-hero, but sometimes you're not always sure that Vance understands how repulsive he is. Do you know what I mean? This is a bit like Boswell not understanding how repulsive the stories he reports on Johnson, whether or not they're accurate, are like really repulsive, and Boswell thinks they're great. And you can kind of tell Vance is like that with Kugel, that he's like, haha, and then Kugel did this and this, yep, I'm implying rape. And you're like, no, don't do that. Like, that's a really frivolous, flippant way to do something that makes me hate that character. It's not just like, I'm like, man, he's an anti-hero. I'm like, oh no.
Also makes you feel a bit weird about the author, because I think while sometimes, like for our conversations that we had about Shadow, I was like, oh, I can't really tell if Gene Wolfe is just a product of his time or if he's trying to intentionally do something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Whereas like sometimes you're reading it and you feel like, okay, I feel like this author has particular views that do not align with my own, you know, when you're reading stuff.
I think there's, is it Brent Weeks' first novel, The Shining Blinding Knife? Someone in the comments, if you can remember it, the first of his light cycle, whatever it's called. I only own that. I haven't read it, but people are like, it's a really good series. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I say that, some people are like, I really enjoyed it up to like book 4, and then I was like, wait, that ruins everything. I don't really know the details, but like the first bit, like, I really liked it. It is weird how much breasts are spoken about, and I think that is the thing that you're like, that feels like it might be an authorial concern rather than a character concern. It's tough. So with Severian, the example you're using, you're aware, you're like, actually, you're meant to see this guy as a traumatized guy who doesn't know how to relate to women. So maybe some of this is that. Whereas here, you're like, no, it's basically a third person, semi-limited, semi-perfect. It's like it's third person narrator. It's not strongly characterized. It's not like a in their head view. It's more like this is what they did. This is what they wanted to do. So it is Jack Vance narrating, and so it is strange that some of this stuff gets said. The same with the Dying Earth books, that you're like, I actually read an interesting post recently by an RPG designer actually called David McGrogan, who also is lots of classic sci-fi fantasy, comparing Gene Wolfe and C.S. Lewis, I think it's those two, with Jack Vance, because like, I've read loads of these people recently. I really enjoy all of them, but like you can tell that Vance just has this kind of, he's one of his strengths is he's so creative about displaying different cultures and cultural ideals and morals, but then you kind of realize it's partly because he doesn't really care, and so sometimes you get to realize it's not really like a moral core to the story. It's just this stuff he doesn't really care about, and I think that is maybe like, I don't know, is that how far is that a problem is kind of an interesting question. How far do you need to align with Jack Vance's view of the world to enjoy the thing he's writing?
Or any author at all. I think it only becomes a problem when I think it only becomes a problem when you, like, you know, I was saying about Samuel Johnson's biography, where I felt like I'm not meant to be hearing this because it's all stuff about women and how stupid women are and how there's no such thing as an intelligent woman and women need to know their place and all of this stuff that I'm like, it just kind of got to a point where it felt really uncomfortable for me to listen to that, because it's not just like him saying like, oh, well, you know, I personally think this about the relationship between church and state. And I might think to myself, well, I don't agree with that, but I'll listen to you talk about it. When somebody's like kind of like questioning your like humanity because of something that you literally can't help.
Off-stream, you're obviously kind of saying that you felt like there's a degree to which this was written like by men, but also like your point about you shouldn't be there is because it's written for men. It's written for this male audience of people who are in those kinds of conversations theoretically.
It felt like they never would have thought, oh, some female PhD student in 2022 will be looking at this. It definitely feels like it was designed for men of their time, and it feels like the kind of conversations that men would have when women aren't around, and that's why it felt really strange. It's different because it's a biography and it's literally like real conversations that people already had, or letters, so you know that it is their views, whereas with an author, I think most of the time you can sometimes, like in Dune, there are certain things that Herbert brings up again and again and again that I'm kind of like, I feel like he has a bit of a thing about this as an author, and it comes through, but I don't think it's an issue until the incest storylines, repeated incest storyline is a little bit like, I'm curious why you kept on coming back to this. And that kind of thing. But there were other things like his real focus on looking back to like classical political history, his real kind of obsession with that as a predictor for the future. Now, that's not necessarily something I have any feelings on either way, but it was very obvious to me that he as an individual had strong feelings about that because it kept on coming up, and it was a really clear theme in his book.
Like a big theme of the Dune books is about, in a non-ethnic sense, if you understand what I mean, racial destiny, like special destiny, the way history works, the kind of the gears of history. Someone else who's interested in that is Isaac Asimov in the Foundation series. The idea that someone comes up with a system. Harry Seldon is a statistician, I think, who works out how to basically predict the future. Not in every detail. He doesn't know that you and I will have this conversation at this time, but like the political history of the future. And then that is screwed up partially via like crazy mutations. So like, oh yeah, suddenly this big thing has changed. And I think that's interesting, but it's something where certainly it is more traditional at that time, particularly in sci-fi, to push a strong thesis, like reading Stars by Destination, reading to a degree Canticle for Leibowitz, you can, and Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, somewhat Broken Sword, even though Broken Sword is fantasy and has a less strong thesis. Often in 50s sci-fi or around that era, there is a point, and even you do get it even in the new wave, like Michael Moorcock writing fantasy in the 60s, where suddenly the author is like, hey guys, I've got some opinions. And this is actually a lot more like those 18th century novelists, isn't it? That suddenly you are aware that you're here to like, and it's complex, isn't it? Because sometimes you don't mind when a character in a really in-character way expresses something that you know is the author's opinion. That kind of, I think, feels okay, because there you're parsing the author. You don't have to. The character is expressing themselves naturally. But I think it's really typical in lots of those novels. And you get this certainly in Dune, because Dune is written in such a beautiful but arch style. We talked about this in our first video we ever did, that like Herbert writes beautifully. People think it's ugly writing, but it's not. In terms they think it's really, but like, no, it's really carefully arch. And that means it's really obvious that he is now telling you something serious. Particularly in Dune itself, in the first book itself. I think in Dune Messiah, there's just this hint of this with Alia and stuff. There's a hint of something else where he actually is like, Alia is a really interesting character in that book, because he actually writes a character for once.
Yes.
albeit it's one of the weirder, one of many weird things that goes on in those books. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when, I think I actually don't mind if an author's like, I've kind of got a bit of an opinion that I'm wanting to put into this, because I think even in contemporary literature, that is still a very, I would say even as common, but it's just different things that people are talking about now, different narratives that people are wanting to discuss. And so they're wanting to make room for that in a story so that they can bring to light situations that cause a discussion of the things that they're interested in. Particular, I don't need to go into examples, but you know what kind of things I'm talking about.
I think that's a good sci-fi example of that is the Broken Earth trilogy, which all three won the Hugo. Two of them did not deserve the Hugo. The first one probably did. Broken Earth, the fifth season, sorry, is the first one. The Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which obviously are, amongst many other things, trying to talk about race, and like they're pretty explicit to the point that like origins for these Earth affecting telepaths, they can they're seismic telepaths basically, or telekinetic people. They're the abusive nickname. They're obviously slaves. They're obviously kind of in this position of slavery to the majority, and there are a bunch of kind of racialized. Like there's obviously this way in which they are plantationized and enslaved, and their breeding is managed and stuff. And privilege only comes through serving in particular ways. There's no kind of self-expression there. And that is quite complicated the way that Jemisin presents it, but you can see she is like, and it's not one note or simplistic in every way. She's definitely talking about American racial politics. She herself is a person of color from America. She's writing in this Africa, but where there's in this kind of sci-fi Africa, but with racialized elements, and there's this enslaved caste with an abusive nickname like that, and you're like, oh, okay, she's still trying to talk. And
actually, I think that there's kind of there's always going to be that crossover, I think, between like ideas and like big difficult conversations in art, not just literature, but in other art forms, media as well, film and television. I think the weird thing is when the author isn't aware that they're probably expressing something that they might not even recognize as a part of themselves. And then it kind of feels a bit strange because you feel like the authors kind of unmask themselves a bit without realizing it in the book. I think it's fine if an author like is intentionally kind of pushing a question or topic or idea. But yeah, sometimes when people they're just putting in little quirks into their book that make you feel a bit uncomfortable, kind of like sexualizing young girls and things like that in books where you kind of feel like, and it's never really dealt with. It's just kind of like, this sexy 11-year-old girl. And you're like,
it's not such an important element that it's part of the story that you're like, man, this is really interesting and dark and difficult. It is just like a implicit thing. And I guess that's different to the pontificating of Samuel Richardson or of Alfred Bester, who are like, here's just my opinion about something. In that sense, that's very out in the open, and you can hate it or you can love it, but it's out there. And it's interesting, by the way, Canticle for Leibowitz and Stars My Destination they're both anxious about nuclear war, but it's interesting, and they both have some kind of message of hope, but they're very different ones. Like for Bester, it's just this kind of like egalitarian, once everyone is educated and we're freed from the systems of oppression, once we're able to move beyond technological limitations, he's like, things will get better. We are at risk of this, but because we're oppressed and ignorant. Whereas I think Canticle actually is a lot more kind of skeptical of the idea of progress, and is like, so actually what happens is that there's always the risk of this happening again and again, because as we get the weaponry, we don't have the morality to go with it. We're not people, but it does also think that there is always like a literal and figurative, really sacred flame of human knowledge, of human civilization that can be preserved and taken forward through disaster. So there's a kind of resilience, and these are both really different opinions, but they are just both out there, and they're both things the authors wanted to talk about. Whereas Jack Vance being like, it was the summer before her 9th birthday, and her like 30-year-old tutor obviously has a crush on her, and you're like, if that was in real life, I think we'd tar and feather him, wouldn't we? In the
Right,
book,
you'd
he's quite a
hope
nice
that
character.
the
The one chap.
author would be, yeah, you'd hope the author would be like, and isn't that horrible? But it's when they're like, oh, and this is just something that I think is fine. It's like, I remember when I was reading Vanity Fair, and it really occurred to me after a while that William, who is in love with Amelia and is always being ignored by Amelia and ends up going off to India, still in love with her and constantly being ignored because she's still pining for her husband. Then it occurred to me that, like, Thackeray's name is William, that he spent much of his life as a young man in India. And it kind of feels personal at times, like how much the author, because he does insert himself into this story, and he kind of calls her like stupid and vain, basically, and like, how can she not see that this man is in love with her and he's so good to her and he's such a good friend to her? Why doesn't she want to be in a romantic relationship with him? And I kind of was feeling like, have you been stung by somebody? Because I feel like you're putting a lot of energy into hating this girl who's ignoring a guy called William who ends up spending a lot of time in India. Like, I don't.
Yeah. Like, I guess it's natural.
That is the case, but that's kind of.
Got a good segue here, but like, I think it's natural and inevitable to some degree that authors insert themselves into their work, and that, like, you can't completely patrol or control your own influence on your story, which sounds crazy because you're the one writing it, but like, art is an extension of self at some level, I would say. And as in, it's not alien to the self. In that case, you can have your death of the author as a technical category, but not as a real category, because the author is always present in the work and invades the work from outside it. So in that sense, it's kind of like, oh, it's inevitable. But it does feel like those examples round. I think, by the way, if you want to see the flip side of it, what about the way in which we talked about Regency romance, how often it's a genre defined by cheap erotica, like bad erotica, and how much that is something where you're like, how far does this tell us about the authors, not just their intended audience, but also about the way the authors engage with the material. They just think about Colin Firth, and they then want to kind of put out a fairly kind of cheap fantasy on Mr. Darcy Colin Firth, and like that probably does say something about them. You can't separate yourself from it. So I guess the question is how far you're able to turn that into something productive.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't think it's even a bad thing if authors, like we've been saying, it's not a bad thing for authors to put themselves into their books. I don't think that would make me feel uncomfortable unless I feel like the author that I'm getting to know while I'm reading this book, like you were saying with this guy and the 9-year-old whose like tutor is in love with her. It's only then that we start to, it's like I've had that experience when I've been reading Jane Austen, when I was reading Emma, and it was the first time that I felt like, ooh, there's a cultural shift here. So I was reading Emma, and Mr. Knightley in this beautiful romantic speech is like, oh, I've been in love with you since you were 13, Emma, when he would have been in his late 20s. And I was feeling like, it's a weird thing to admit in a romantic speech.
With that, you can maybe separate that from the other example. I guess that's one thing, is in that case, we're actually talking about something where Emma would then be counted as a pubescent young adult. We actually use that phrase, don't we, young adult now. That's a modern phrase, but Emma would have been seen in those terms. And so the idea that a man might have designs on a pubescent girl at that age without advancing them wasn't crazy then. It's not something that Jane Austen is inserting in. It's actually a cultural thing that is normal. Whereas I guess with Vance, the disturbing thing is you're like, by the way, I'm not slandering Jack Vance's memory or anything by this. I'm not saying he himself had any weird habit. But you're like, I don't know how to read the fact, because this isn't like, is it that you're saying it's really normal in culture for that to happen? It doesn't feel like it. It feels like
is it time period, when you would often have dramas, when you little comedies from like the 50s and 60s where you would have kind of like grown adult men very much engaged in kind of these long flirtations with pubescent girls who were like 14, 15 years old.
Yeah.
And that was kind of culturally normal.
I know Sid James would not be successfully flirting, but maybe more going to be like a Roger Moore or Sean Connery thing where they are like talking to a 15-year-old girl in a swimsuit, and you're like, aren't you literally like 38 or something?
Yeah, and which now we look back and we think, oh gosh, that's horrible. But at the time, people probably wouldn't have questioned it, because it would have been, not saying there was nothing wrong with it, but culturally it would have been viewed as normal.
Well, one thing is, of course, there are all other kinds of, we'll move on, but there's all other kinds of cultural boundaries and shifts there, which we just don't get. Like, there are a bunch of rules in these old books, in these old movies, about how social interactions work, which is not just the obvious ones that aren't obvious, aren't real anymore. Do you know what I mean? Aren't true. It's the ones we miss. And so we don't get why a situation would be normal. We're like, oh, well, that just seems good or bad based on the one thing. But there's this whole network of social life that we no longer, we no longer get.
I am going to have to, it's a time period. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Because when I'm thinking about a lot of the, even if you look at romances, like romantic comedies from kind of mid-century, a lot of them center on middle-aged men and girls who are like straight out of adolescence.
Yes.
As like a very normal thing.
Oh yeah, and that's partly because those actors were bankable. It's like Tom Cruise is bankable now. Maverick being like the highest grossing US film ever or something.
So then you'd get a really attractive 18-year-old to play across from.
Rather than it being the person, Jennifer Connelly, who is roughly his age, it would be that. And this happens, say, Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly in High Noon. That it's normal for that. Or indeed, Cary Grant and both Grace Kelly and Audrey Hepburn in films. You're like, by the end of it, he's like in his 50s. And he's getting too old to be a romantic lead. One of the reasons he retired was he's like, I can't actually do the parts they want to cast me for. And also he wanted to be at home with his daughter he had late in life. But you're like, oh, that was so normal. Whereas now, yes, even say Lost in Translation is a film like that. Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson. That's maybe the last, it's maybe self-conscious of it, but it's definitely still that kind of.
And we would all very much notice if it was the other way round. I'm not saying these films don't exist, but it would be a real point of like, oh, look, here's a romance with a 50-year-old woman and an 18-year-old man. Like, that would then suddenly become like the whole thing.
Well, I think there has been a couple of films like that very recently where that's the whole that's the angle. That's the, but yeah, it is something which I think rings differently now and I'd be surprised to find many books published in 2022, and I make no comment on that, but I'd be surprised to find many in 2022 that emphasize that without also wanting to emphasize this is bad or something. I'm not saying it is bad, I'm just saying like that would definitely be a cultural thing that I think is different in fiction now. We should wind up soon because we're getting toward our hour anyway, but yeah, what are you reading what are you reading next? And then I'm going to ask you
run in a minute, by the way, because I need to get.
What are you going to read next? Has Abi crashed? No. Could you hear me? I said, what are you reading next? I don't think you can hear me, guys. Disaster.
I don't know if your internet cut then or mine.
Can you hear me now?
You sound like you're trapped inside the internet. I can hear little tiny bits of your voice just screaming to get
out. James or someone else in the comments. Who's?
I don't know if this is my internet or your.
Yeah, trying to get some objective opinions. I think.
Kind of.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is that okay? Any better? Okay, let's do it this way. So, audience, I'm going to make comments and I'm going to highlight them for Abi to see. Yeah, there we go. James is doing it for me. Oh, no, Abby's gone. Should we give her a minute? So I'm going to read next. I think her internet's gone down, hasn't it? What I'm going to read next is I want to finish Sildren's Garden like this week. And then I'm planning on, I've got a few books lined up next month for September, but I do want to get going into Epiphany of the Long Sun, which is the third and fourth books of the Book of the Long Sun by Wolfe. I really feel like I'm on a Wolfe kick where I would like in the next couple of years to get through all his major works. I've bought most of his novels, not all, I say that, half his novels. and I just love Wolfe. But yes, that's my kind of current 2 projects, and I want to read also John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which is obviously classic, early modern classic, early 20th century classic of American life in poverty during and after the Depression in California, which I was given a couple of Christmases ago and I haven't read yet. I've read short Steinbeck books. I've read Mice and Men, The Moon is Down, and Tortilla Flat, but I've not read what's it called? Any of his big books, including The Grapes of Wrath. So I'm hoping to get to that. I did also recently review the first of my 2 500 subs reviews that I agreed to do. So Stars My Destination, I recently reviewed, and I'll be reading Brotherhood of the Black Sword by Larry Correa, which is a modern fantasy. I'll be doing that in September. I know James wants me to do Necroscope, so whenever I next do a review contest thing, I will make sure to put Necroscope in there for you to fight for. Yeah, Tarzan. So I read. I don't like. Is Tarzan trash? I've barely read any Tarzan. I haven't read any for a long time. Only when I was much younger. I did recently read the first Amtor book, which is Venus by Burroughs. Like, there's Mars, obviously. There's Pellucidar, which is the inner world. There's Tarzan, and there's Amtor, Venus, which are all part of the same shared universe. And yeah, I I thought it was decent. It wasn't as good as the Mars novels. Was it you, James, who was saying recently they'd reread all the Mars novels and really only liked the first, second, and 10th ones? I feel like it was that you were like, yeah, these other ones just aren't as good. Burroughs, I suspect, is very variable because, I feel like that is not a controversial view. He wrote a lot. He wrote, he must have written 40 or so novels over in 25 years. So I think that's probably part of why, at least, his work is so variable. But yeah, I will probably read some more Venus early next year. I think is my plan, is the next Burroughs. And then maybe I will read Tarzan next year as well. Yes, James. I thought I remembered it was you with the Mars thing. The Mars books are great, but yeah, Burroughs, very spotty. Lots of the pulp writers are very spotty, though, aren't they? When you read enough of them, you realise they're churning out so much. There's only, and you see some people are so productive in a really short period. Like Bradbury writes a dozen books in 20 books in 15 years or something. Most of his classic books also are from the 50s. He lives to the noughties, but most of his best known books are from the 50s. So I think there were upsides and downsides to that method of production. That it did mean that writers who were hot just wrote a lot of really good stuff, I think, is maybe the upside. The downside is that, you, as you say, you read all the Tarzans and then you're like, wait, half of this is garbage. Let alone whatever things you might not like in the book. So just technically they end up, some of them are very rushed. But anyway, I think we just have to assume Abi is gone for today, with the internet having dropped presumably her end. But she has a book, Oh Dear Maria. I'm going to go and get it. I'll advertise for her. Here we are. So this is Oh Dear Maria. This is Abi's book. She is writing a sequel to it, actually, available on Amazon. I bought this copy. This is my own copy. It is a period satire of classic literature, but it's pretty approachable and easy for people who don't read that stuff. It's very funny. It's sometimes very emotionally intense. I would, from my own perspective, I'm biased, of course. Abi's my friend. I'd recommend it. She'll be able to give it a better sales pitch than me. But yeah, and it's often free or cheap on Kindle as well if you read there. So I will give her pitch for that now. Anyway, we'll leave it there for today, and we will, I will be back. If Abi has the internet again by then, she'll be back as well sometime next month. And yeah, tell us what's some good stuff to think about. What are your self-pub and indie reads that you've enjoyed in the last months or years, in recent months, to add to Abby's discussion earlier? And what are examples of weird authorial tics that bother you, like Jack Vance being weird about women? Yeah, put that in the comments. Till next time. Bye.